since I didn't get too many strongly worded objections about the moon's rotation talk that I gave last week, I thought I'd talk a little bit more about another interesting rotation topic, which is the rotation of the planet Mercury. And in some ways, that's even more interesting than the moon. I grew up in the 1950s and 60s when every astronomy textbook that you read said that the rotation period of Mercury was 88 days. It was exactly matched to the period of its orbit around the sun, and that it kept one face always toward the sun and one face away from the sun permanently, just like the moon does to the Earth. And there were science fiction stories that were based upon this. They had a hot side and a cold side, and then a livable band along the edge there, where the temperature was somewhere in between. And so that was what everyone thought the situation was until 1965. And in 1965, some radio astronomers down at Arecibo Observatory used their planetary radar to illuminate Mercury and look for a Doppler shift. And when they did, it's looking for a Doppler shift from a planet is kind of like a police radar on the Earth that uses that. There they bounce radio waves off of you and see how fast your car is moving. It actually shifts the frequency of the return radio waves that go back to the Doppler, to the radar unit. And for a planetary radar, of course, you need megawatts and that you transmit in a really big antenna, and you receive back minuscule amounts, a tiny, far lower than a nanowatt. I forget how small it is, 10 to the minus 18 or something watts. And but we have sensitive enough receivers that you can detect that sort of thing. And what you see are a variety of Doppler shifts. You see some parts of the signal come back with a high Doppler shift shifting toward you, and some have what astronomers call blue shift, have a red shift rather, shifting away from you. That is, it looks like like it's a car receding from you. And by seeing the total spread of those frequencies, you can figure out how quickly the planet is rotating. Anyhow, they did that, and they were surprised to discover that the period for its day was not 88 days, not 88 Earth days, but it was 59 days, Earth days, which is only 2/3 of the year on Mercury. So, how did that happen? Well, it's how did it happen that it rotates 1.5 times around on its axis for each time it goes around the sun? What physics are involved, but also how did the astronomers get that so badly wrong? And I guess the astronomy part is pretty easy to understand why they got it wrong, because Mercury is quite close compared to us, is quite close to the sun, and so when we look at it in the sky, it's always fairly close to the sun in the sky. You just see it a little bit after sunset or before sunrise above the horizon. And that's only at certain times of the year when the geometry is right. And so they only appeared at particular windows. They weren't looking at it all the time. And it has faint markings on it. And they were expecting to see this 88-day period, and so they convinced themselves that they were seeing the features they expected to see based on an 88-day period. And in fact, it was really only 2/3 of that, and it goes around, rotates 1.5 times for every time it goes around the sun, and it's locked into that. It's been like that for a long period of time. And the question is, well, how does that? What's the physics of something like that? How does it work? Well, if we think about what we learned about the moon last week, remember that the moon we went above the Earth and moon, above the moon's planetary orbit around the Earth, and looked at the egg shape in it, which is exaggerated. When the moon was rotating too slowly, now this isn't a frame that's rotating around with the moon, so the Earth is fixed and the moon is fixed. And when the moon rotated too slowly, it would fall behind and get tugged back downward like a pendulum. And when it was rotating too fast, it got out ahead. So we talked about this last week. That's what happens with the moon. But Mercury's a little different, and this is a chart showing everything going on at once here. This is the what happens over the space of a Mercury year. So from 1 year to the next year, 88 days later, these are a few snapshots of what's going on. And here's Mercury, again with a kind of exaggerated ellipsoidal shape there. And the bulge, I started out with a bulge pointing toward the sun. And then as time goes on, it's actually rotating faster than it's going, or faster than it's orbiting. And as a result, there's a slow rotation even within that frame going along with Mercury staying fixed. So it's slowly rotating like this, and the bulge goes around, and it works out since it rotates 1.5 times and it goes around the sun once. It ends up the net rotation as a half of a turn. So a whole Mercury year later, it's turned halfway around like it shows here. And then, so the question is, well, gee, we have those torques, I understood with the moon what was going on. Why, you have the torques acting to pull it this way and that way, but it looks like it's in all the different geometries. It's going to get average out, and the torques will, or the forces, the rotating forces that I call torques, but anyhow, they will, average out to nothing. And that would be true if it had a circular orbit. But it's got an orbit that's got about 20% eccentricity, which means it's actually 20% closer to the sun part of the year and 20% farther away at its farthest. That's a big change. And the forces that work on these bulges are very sensitive to distance, such that the restoring force that's trying to turn the pendulum is actually almost 3.5 times stronger when Mercury is at its closest to the sun than when Mercury is at its aphelion, at its farthest point from the sun. And so the points when the bulge is close, either the front bulge or the back bulge here, those points when it's closest to the sun are being acted on much more strongly by the sun's gravitational forces. And when the sides of Mercury here are presenting themselves to the sun, it's much weaker, and so those forces are not really having much effect. So it's getting dinged each time, getting pushed back and forth each time it gets near the sun, and that's how it got into this. Well, that's why it's staying in this funny state of this three halves resonance is what an astronomer would call it. And again, how it got into that state in the first place is an interesting story, but sort of beyond, just like with the moon, it's beyond this this presentation. Maybe I'll talk about it some other time. So that's it for the astronomy tidbit. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my week at the club. This is the chess portion, and I'll be glad to share my thoughts on my game last night that I played with Ken Gurge, and see how it turned out. It was. I guess I say this every week, but if your games aren't interesting, you shouldn't be playing chess. If they aren't interesting to you, I guess is the thing. So we played a French defense. Ken opened up with e4, and I responded with e6. We had the last few games we played Roy Lopez's, and I decided to go back to a French. He expected it, though, actually, because I had played a French against, I think it was against Dave Kuchar several weeks ago. And he saw how that went, so he had boned up on it a bit. But he expected after the knight d2, which is a Tarrasch variation of the French, he expected me to actually play a somewhat more modern move, c5, which can get into isolated queen-pawn sorts of positions, and had analyzed that a bit, and instead was surprised when I played just the classical variation. So he went along the main line in the classical, though, pushing the pawn and driving my knight back. Then he played knight to f3, which actually is okay in this position if you look at the opening databases. It's quite common. I played c5 to typical French move, counterattacking in the center. He bolsters that point at d4, so he has that long pawn chain now on the dark squares, and my idea is to try to loosen those up if I can. Start by playing my other knight to c3, so now I've got more pressure on d4 here and also on e5. He develops his bishop, and I looked at this position for a while, thought about developing my bishop to e7, which seemed like the best square for it. But then I noticed that this d pawn was a little weak. So I went in for this idea involving queen to b6. And it turned into an interesting or fun position for Ken, I should say. Interesting times for me, sort of the Chinese curse. Because what he did was to go ahead and let me win that pawn. Or if you want to, he sacked the pawn. So what he did was to castle, and I had that pawn attack 3 times, so I can go ahead and win it. But he attacks my queen, and my queen, I could have played here over to g4, but I didn't like the idea of it, the 2 bishops and the knight, and maybe pawn support could really hassle my queen over there. I decided that a safer square to go back to was b6, and that's actually the most common reply here. And in fact, when I analyze this with Stockfish, all 8 of the last ply, that is the 4 last moves for each of us, were all the first choice of the computer. So even though we were both a little worried about going down this line, it wasn't ridiculous from the computer's point of view. Although if you look into the database of master games, it turns out that that White has a big lead here in actual results. He's won, what, 150 times to Black's 55 victories, and out of 250 games. So it's pretty commonly reached. However, now we fairly quickly diverge, because Queen E2 was only played 4 times out of those 250, and Black won 2 of those and drew 2 of those. So not the best move. And normally the queen either comes out here to A4, or won't allow me to do it because there's no piece there. Okay, comes out here to A4, or goes to C2 would be another possibility for the queen, be a reasonable square. But I think Ken liked the idea of supporting his e-pawn, and on the surface of it, it looks quite natural. And so I was, having a few problems here, trying to get my pieces developed, trying to figure out what squares they stand on. Because Black is definitely cramped. Black is very solid. I'll go take that move back there. Black's very solid in this position, but how do you go about improving your position? It seemed like maybe the bishop either belonged on e7 or possibly on c5, but I really only wanted it on c5 if I was there to neutralize his bishop, and it looked like it would be all too easy to chase it away from c5 if I developed it there. Also, this light squared bishop, which is always a problem in the French, is even more of a problem here. And so the situation is quite awkward for Black. And so I made what looked to me like a useful waiting move, keeping his bishop out of g5, also his knight out of g5, and trying to encourage him to make the move bishop to e3. And if he'd be cooperative and do that, I was planning to play my bishop to c5, and either he trades him off or he retreats it and gives me the diagonal, and then tries to chase me off of that square later. He didn't do that though. Instead, what he did after my h3 was to play, or h6 rather, was to play a3 on his part, and now he's saying he's going to be fighting for the c5 square with b4. And I think that's quite a reasonable move. So since I wouldn't be able to keep my bishop on c5, I developed it to e7. And of course it's quite useful there because it controls these dark squares on the king side. And of course in the French you really always have to watch out. If you castle on the king side, it can be quite easy for white to attack. I probably should have pointed out one of the reasons that you'd put the queen on c2 earlier was because the queen and bishop form a battery along this diagonal, although now that I've moved the pawn, that wouldn't be quite as much of an issue. So anyhow, I played bishop to e7 to keep the bishop and knight out of this g5 square. And Ken went along and completed his thought, his expansion on the queen side. But I was a little glad to see this because it gave me something to play for over there with a5. You know, that the pawn is a little overextended. It's only defended by a pawn, and now I've got to attack twice. So if he wants to hang on to it, he either trades it off or has to defend it again. He chose not to. Instead, he attacked my queen, and my queen completed her undevelopment. And now it's really looking quite sad for the black pieces with all those, with only two of my minor pieces having been developed. But it's still a very compact position and not real easy for white to attack, but I would much rather be white in this position. You know, with these unfettered rooks on the back rank that can develop where they choose to. It would be quite easy to formulate an attack or to attack in the center or the queen side, wherever. Instead he pinned my knight, which caused me problems because as you'll see, I get into a bit of a bind in a few moves, and it looks like I'm in this position able to win the b pawn, but that can cause some real problems. So I did go ahead and trade the pawns off, and now I have to do something about my rook on a8. So I traded the rooks off as well, and this is the point at which I could go ahead and snatch the let's not do it with an arrow. Let's do it here. So after the rooks are traded off, I could actually go ahead and take that pawn on b4. But this can get into lots and lots of difficulties. So I felt that, a likely move on his part would be to play queen to b2. My bishop will either have to retreat or be defended. If I retreated it, which seems like it would be the solid move, I actually lose immediately with bishop to b6. And if my queen takes it, then he takes check, and now he's won my queen. Right? So there's that discovered attack there on my queen that was unmasked. So, it's a pretty dangerous position. Notice, of course, that this knight is pinned, so the knight couldn't take the bishop. So the queen had no choice but to take the bishop. So taking that pawn looked, and a couple of other lines I looked at, looked dangerous. So instead I went ahead and castled. I'm already one pawn up. I didn't want to be too greedy, although it would be nice to have two pawns, which is, close to a winning advantage and most of the time. And what Ken did was to play his queen to d2, and now all of a sudden both his queen and bishop are staring down at this pawn on h6, looking to possibly trade the bishop for two pawns and get his queen on h6, and now all of a sudden he has his queen and knight attacking my bare king. Now the only saving grace here in the current position is that I have pretty firm lock on these dark squares with my queen and bishop. And so, for example, I can keep his knight out of g5. So that was something I was glad about, but I had to be very careful over these next few moves that I didn't end up getting myself checkmated. It's just hard to find moves. I thought, as I say in my notes there, I thought about playing the rook to e8, but the problem is then now this knight. The point of that move, rook to e8, was really to allow the knight to come in back to f8 where it could defend my king side. But when I play rook to e8, now all of a sudden I've pinned my knight and the knight can't move. So it's kind of it's a non-starter. It really doesn't work. And how else do I get my knight over to the king side? It's just hard to do. My bishop this light squared bishop is no good. And so it's really only these control over the dark square that kind of keeps me in the position here. And finally I struck upon this move f6, which is actually quite a reasonable defensive move. And it was a little counterintuitive because it really weakens this g6 light square, and I'm already pretty weak with the squares over here on the king side. And I was afraid that the knight would come to h4 and then possibly into g6. And the only way I saw of maybe keeping that from happening was to put my queen on e8, where again my knight is pinned, but at least this way I'm not trying to move my knight, I'm trying to move my queen, and it keeps my queen is on e8, it'll keep his knight out of g6. So I decided to go ahead in for this, fighting for this e5 square. So it's true that he can go ahead and sacrifice now, but if he did, I don't know if I analyzed this in my notes yet. I didn't actually say it, but what I was planning to do if he played bishop takes h6 was actually not to take the bishop back, but to go ahead and take this pawn, probably with the knight. And so this gives me another piece. I mean, the pawn mass there is starting to get to be quite strong, particularly if he trades the knights off. I have this strong pawn mass in the center that's controlling all these important squares. And well, maybe c4 is not too important here, but a lot of central squares. And my bishop can come in through f6 and protect g7. So I wasn't too worried about this situation if we came down this line. But instead, Ken surprised me and played bishop to d4, which I don't think is the best move here, because what that does is it really takes the pressure off of my off of the h6 pawn here, which I was really worried about before. And now I'm happy to go ahead and make some exchanges in the center. I decided to take with the knight. He took back and took with the bishop. I kind of expected him to do it in the other order and end up with a knight on e5. But either way, I have this bishop to f6 move, which ensures that the bishops can get traded off because of the pin to the rook on a8. And what he did was, I think was a good move, was to play the rook to, not a8, a1. He played his rook to e1, so that if I trade the bishops off, at least he gets a very strong rook posted on e5. And I didn't really want to leave that bishop around to cause trouble, and so I did, in fact, go ahead and trade it off, but he now has that strong rook. But I then went, when I was analyzing this whole sequence here, I sort of hallucinated. So I had planned on doing that trade on e5 and then offering a bishop trade, either chasing his bishop off of that diagonal. I mean, I want to get this light squared bishop into the game, and this seemed like the best way to do it. So chasing the bishop off the diagonal, or he allowed me to trade it. And if he takes back with the queen, what I was thinking I would do was to, in this position, was to play queen to c7. I thought this would work because I thought if he played rook takes pawn, that there would be a back rank checkmate. But of course, it's not a checkmate at all. The rook can't come back and give itself away, but the queen can certainly defend. And now I'm simply, it's giving away my advantage. It's even material, 4 pawns to 4. And so I didn't realize that until sometime around here or so, and I saw that idea no longer worked, I should point out in that line that what I expected to have happen because of this queen threat on the back rank. I'm also attacking the rook. I should have pointed out. Okay, and it's not defended. And since I thought that this pawn was verboten, that he couldn't get away with taking it, I thought he'd have to play rook back, and then I would go on the attack, with queen to c2 and things like that, just forcing him to fall into a real defensive posture with a weakness on f2. So anyhow, that was all on a misinterpretation. So instead, I had to play queen to d6, defending that pawn. And, he could have dropped the rook back, but he played... Oh, he did drop the rook back. That's all right. All right. I expected him to play queen to e2. Problem with queen to e2, of course, he's going to... If he did this, I wasn't planning on defending this pawn on e6, because the ways to defend it didn't appeal to me. If I played the rook to e8 here, then this pawn is pinned because there's this double attack. At some point, the queen could spell doom for me. And the other possible way of defending this pawn would have been playing rook to the 6th rank, and that's a bit better, but it's still a little passive there, and I was a little worried about these pawns advancing and taking away squares on my 3rd rank, on the 6th rank. So I didn't want to go into that. What I would have done had he dropped back with his queen as I was expecting was to go ahead and take the b pawn and let him take the supporting pawn on e6. And now it's still 4 pawns to 3. I have 2 passed pawns. They're not connected, but I can force the trade of queens here, right? And he has to drop back, and I trade the queens off, and now I can get behind my d pawn, and if he attacks the b pawn, defend that. And this is I don't know if this is the best play, but I like this rook and pawn endgame. I'm up a pawn, and I think black has good winning chances, but not an easy win. Okay, what happened in the game, instead of playing the queen back to d2, was he dropped the rook to e2. And I got excited about various possibilities here, trying to play queen to f4 and sneaking into... that's on f4. Well, pretend it's on f4, and then sneaking into c1 with it, that kind of thing. But it didn't seem like any of that worked. And instead, I figured maybe the best thing to do here was to activate my rook. Even though it looked nice on this f8 line and put pressure on the f2 pawn, it was defended. And I decided it would be more useful on the c file here. I'm threatening mate immediately. And he gave himself a luft, but now I can get my queen and rook coordinating well together on the c file and offer this trade of queens. If he took, of course, I would take back with my rook in order to keep my e pawn defended. And I think black has quite a good game here. So, for example, let's see, stockfish. So that's nearly a 2 pawn advantage. Okay, so yeah, so that would have been good. He did not take did not take my queen for that reason. He retreated it, and then I played my queen forward. And I had after I made this move, I think I went for a drink of water to go get my water bottle filled. And analyzing my game on my head while I was walking, I had a bit of a hallucination that I was worried about. And I got back to the board, and he made another move, so I didn't look at the hallucination anymore. And I told Ken about it after the game. But the hallucination was that I left myself open to a good move here, that Ken could play queen to g6. And my thinking was that, this is this clever sacrifice. After queen takes rook, queen takes pawn check. my king has to move, and he gets my rook, and now, gee, we've both got 4 pawns and a pair of queens. We each have a queen on the board. This is going to be probably a pretty drawn game. It's not an easy game to win for black at all. Of course, the problem in this analysis away from the board is that if my queen takes on e2, it's defending this pawn on e6. I'm sure you saw that. And so he wouldn't be able to take it because I just play queen takes queen. Anyway, a little historical sidelight or something like that. So instead of going in down that dubious line, what Ken played was queen to d2. But this does allow me just to trade the queens off, which I do. Check. Rook takes with check. And now, so his king has to come up. And now I can defend my e-pawn with my king, activating my king, getting it in the center to support the pawns. And as I mentioned in the text here, I felt comfortable at this point about finding a winning plan. If I look at Stockfish, it's a little over 2-pawn advantage, so 2.5 pawns, something like that. Not, it certainly could, the game could be drawn, but at least the ideas here are quite clear, I think, that black wants to support and push this d-pawn as far as he can, and if possible, if white lets him, to also use the e-pawn to support it, or the king to support it. So what actually happened? Well, I should have mentioned in this position right here, the immediate threat is that I will play rook to b1, and then he can't hold on to this b-pawn. So he has to defend that somehow. And what he chose to do was to, I guess that's really the only way to defend it, is to play rook to b2. It's pretty much forced. And I played b5 in order to keep his pawn as far back as possible, and also to give myself some strong squares here as far up the board as I could. He played h4, and I got those central pawns rolling. He came out with his king, and I checked it here, which is kind of cute, because if he goes forward, which is what he did, then he's cut himself off, his king off from stopping this d-pawn. Right, so it's going to be a lot harder for, he'll only have his rook, and I will have my rook and to defend the pawn, and possibly my king as well, and so it makes it a lot harder for him to stop it. So I think at this point, when I check him, he really needs to go to e2, and which keeps his king from coming over here and causing any trouble on the king side. So he has to commit one way or the other. Instead, he went to g4, and I played my king up to keep his king from intruding and coming after my pawns. He played his king back to h3, I think maybe having second thoughts about getting so far away from the central pawns, but it's really too late now. So I press my e-pawn first. Usually a pass, when you have a passed pawn, several pawns, like if you have 3 pawns against 2 and one of the pawns is passed, then you push the passed pawn first. But it seemed like in this position it made more sense to push the e-pawn, because that prevents his f-pawn from advancing. It also gives my king entry into the position over here. So he came back at this king. Then I was able to get my pawns as a duo again, abreast of one another. Pawn to g4. It does, at this point, basically, white is pretty well lost. I'm able to push a pawn. Now I'm threatening to play my rook to c2, chasing his rook off of the rank, and now I'll be able to play my pawn to c2. So he preemptively moved his rook off of the rank, encouraging me to push the pawn, and where then it would be possibly overextended. If I played d2 here, he would go ahead and play rook to d1, and now I can't play rook c1 because I have to defend the pawn. But I have a better move than that, which is to bring the king in for support. He brought his king up, and this is a blunder, but at this stage in the game, there's really nothing that can save the game. So this does allow me just to play check and advance the pawn. And now he looked at it for a while and resigned. The reason being that after the king moves, well, or I suppose he could block with the pawn, although that's not a great move. That's no different than the king move. I could either take the pawn check, or what I would more likely do is to do what I was planning to do if the king moves, which is to play rook c1, and then his rook is blocked from the queening square, so I'll get a queen on the next move. So it was fun. I looked at it with Lee chess, and the Lee chess analysis is kind of funny because it looks like a cross section of the continental shelf or something. If you imagine some mountains and then the ocean, and then it kind of drops off and gets into deeper and deeper water. But basically, it was a fairly, there were no enormous blunders by either one of us. I slowly amassed an advantage. There were a couple of points here where things got worse for him, such as that's this point here. Well, I already analyzed the game, so I won't try to go through the whole thing for you. But there was this point where I was able to play f6, and when he played that bishop to d4, which surprised me, which made matters worse. And another point here where after I'd played queen to c4, he dropped his queen to d2, which allowed the queen trade. But, they're only fairly minor inaccuracies. It was just kind of a war of attrition, I think. So that was the game. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next week from my week at the club. Bye-bye.